The African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, the U.S. trade program that provides African countries with duty-free access to American markets, expires today. This has raised concerns among nations that rely heavily on exports to the United States. The future of AGOA, approved by the U.S. in 2000 to assist sub-Saharan African economies, has been thrown into doubt by President Donald Trump's trade wars. But for more on this, we are joined by Trade and International Relations Analyst Viwe Ntshongwana. Viwe, good to have you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Leanne.
All right, I suppose, many people do know why AGOA is so important, but let's just give a little bit more perspective. Why does AGOA matter so much for the continent?
It gives duty-free access to the U.S. economy, and by doing so, it makes African goods, in particular from sub-Saharan Africa, more competitive in the global economy, and therefore all the pricing around those goods is determined by that duty-free market access.
So unfortunately, the reality is that AGOA is concluding today. By the end of today, it is something. There needs to be movement, and many African countries are seeking to have it renewed, including South Africa, for at least a decade. I'm reading that there are, hopes that it may be extended for a year, perhaps a 2-year period, perhaps it won't be extended. So right now, everything is up in the air. But how crucial is it, particularly for critical sectors in car factories in South Africa, and something like horticulture in Kenya?
Yes, it's very critical, Leanne, that AGOA is extended. As you have mentioned, that it has been ongoing for a period of 25 years, first 15 years, and then an additional 10 years. So obviously, certain industries and sectors, certain businesses have modeled themselves in relation to AGOA, and their business cases are based on that preferential market access. So in its absence, there'll definitely be businesses that falter, number one, and that go under, to the extent of going under. And in particular for South Africa, I think it's very important that AGOA continues for South Africa in light of the trade wars, if we can call them wars, that are taking place, and the reciprocal trade tariffs of 30%, because all of that, South Africa has got high levels of unemployment, increasing levels of unemployment, and those levels of unemployment may create other volatilities, social volatilities, and so on. So we can't afford in South Africa to lose another job.
Certainly can't. And I'm just looking at some estimates that, there could possibly be on the continent a study estimating about 350,000 direct jobs have been created through AGOA, and indirectly about 1 million jobs. So, this is something that we certainly can't even think about in terms of losing these jobs. One job lost is far too many. But this is the reality if, in fact, we don't see some sort of a deal being met. The repercussions could be massive.
Definitely, Leanne. But let me put this forward to you. Trade has been weaponized, and it has been weaponized even before the presidency of Donald Trump. So I think it's high time for South Africa and other African countries to start thinking of post-AGOA scenarios and preparing their economies to that extent, because currently it seems like there are no guarantees. We don't know what are the issues that are at play that will determine whether AGOA continues, but obviously the reciprocal tariffs have overridden many of the incentives that are in AGOA. So already AGOA is watered down. And I think from a place of foresight, we need to start preparing our economies, diversifying them beyond the scope of AGOA.
Yeah, yeah, and that is the reality, and I think that, that's been a lot of talk happening behind the scenes to try and mitigate the effects. We've already tried to mitigate the effects with, the trade tariffs that we've seen coming through, and so have other African countries. In fact, globally, this has been happening. But if we look at what's been happening now, because Trade, Industry and Competition Minister Park Stau has said that he is very hopeful that a trade pact giving many African countries preferential access to the US market will be extended. Have you been privy to some of the text in the negotiations? Because I believe there's been quite a heavy text that has been sent to the US to try and negotiate and try and get this extension.
Look, Leanne, I think other than what I've read from various sources, it does seem as though we are in a bit of a, some say we're in a favorable situation where AGOA could be continued for a year or two, and others are asking why has it taken up until the last day, and therefore it's unlikely. But I think one thing that I must mention, Leanne, and I think I alluded to it in my comments before, but let me put it in this manner. Governance, you govern at two levels. You govern based on reality, which is what is happening, and you also govern based on hypothetical situations, possibilities, and probabilities. And I think the probability and the possibility around AGOA has always been, well, not always, but recently has been that it might not be continued. And I think it's very important that as we seek an extra year or two in the continuation of AGOA, we need to ask those very important questions about what happens if it doesn't happen, because we can't always get flat-footed around these situations. Another thing that I must mention is that AGOA is just one piece of a very broad puzzle when it comes to the global economy. And domestic economies now need to position themselves in relation to global value chains and speak to the supply and demands of global value chains, and not only in relation to the US. Yeah. So I think South Africa needs to now start engaging the full extent of the global economy, so that whether we proceed with AGOA or whether it is not continued, we form our economy to speak to global value chains.
Yeah. One thing I think we need to, and one would hope that in the negotiating tactics, South Africa must never undersell itself, because we have got a lot to offer. We certainly do. I mean, South Africa supplies a number of critical minerals to the US, and 12 on a US list, 9 major suppliers. LNG is something that is a very big interest when it comes to energy supply, and South Africa can come to the table with this as well. But I think one of our big problems, and it has been for a while, is the inclusion of South Africa on the list because of the status where we stand. And, besides what we have, something in terms of where South Africa sits in an upper to middle class income country, that I think could not, it always has been hanging over South Africa, whether it will continue to be included or not. But we do have negotiating power. I'm hoping we're using this in our favor.
No, I do believe that we are using it in our favor. And I think, President Trump has been perhaps purported to be an unreasonable negotiator and so on. I don't necessarily think so, but he's probably trying to do what he considers is best for the US economy. So I definitely think that the delegations that are going there, led by various ministers, Minister Park Stau, and also the Minister of DIRCO, Minister Lamula, I think those delegations are definitely representing South Africa well. But that said, diversification is inevitable. And I think the resources that you've mentioned, we must not only articulate them in relation to AGOA and the US, but we must speak to those resources in relation to the global economy and the global demand, and also try to strike deals globally. I know when we speak of AGOA, we tend to think that, let me not call it the be-all and end-all. It is very important, but I think there's an inevitability about it that at some point it will expire, whether in President Trump's presidency or the next president or at some later stage. And South Africa, whether AGOA is there or not, we have to diversify our economy and even punch beyond our weight because of the challenges that we are facing of unemployment and various other economic challenges in our domestic economy.
Yeah, Viwe, I think important point raised there is that, whether it happens at the end of today or what happens in a year or 2 years' time, we need to buffer, we need to make a plan. As I let you go, because we've got 1 minute left, let's say tomorrow we open up our eyes and it hasn't been renewed and things are not there anymore for us. I mean, when you look at some studies, they say that the GDP, South Africa's overall GDP, the decline won't be too bad, 0.06%, but that is bad enough for us in this current environment. What do you believe we need to do immediately to try and sort that out?
Immediately, Leanne, is to find new markets because ultimately the employment is dependent on certain commodities and goods being exported. Some business models and many business models are exclusively determined by exports. So I think even now, and I believe that it may have been happening in the background, but we need to find other markets where there is a demand. And also South Africa needs to get a sense of the developmental needs of countries in Africa, the developmental needs of other countries around the world, and start to speak into those developmental needs in terms of supplying those countries with goods, supplying them with different commodities that may help them that may assist them towards development. Right. So South Africa's economy needs to be positioned as a developmental economy in terms of international relations, and we need to target countries that are developing in order to supply those countries with our goods and resources.
Viwe, thanks so much for talking to us. Viwe Ntshongwana, Trade and International Relations Analyst, speaking about that deadline today for AGOA. Will it be renewed? Won't it? And what the repercussions will be either way.